Well, welcome. Tonight, we have a very special person on, somebody who we're counting on doing a lot of good things for the 4th District and helping us out. Congressman, why don't you start with an introduction?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me on. It's always good to be speaking to Milford. I'm Jake Auchincloss. I'm your representative in Congress for the Massachusetts 4th. And I recently assumed the office on January 3rd, taking over from Joe Kennedy. Was a city councilor in Newton, worked in the private sector, businesses both big and small, and served in the Marine Corps for 5 years.
So have you gotten used to being called Congressman?
I have not gotten used to having a staff that as tightly manages my schedule as they do. It's I had to ask for permission to go get lunch this afternoon.
Well, it seems like Matt cuts it pretty tight when he said, I've got exactly 30 minutes.
He's a sharp taskmaster.
Why don't we start with an area near and dear to your heart, ARP. Your impression?
So the American Rescue Plan was President Biden's top priority. It was the promise that Democrats campaigned on, and we got it done. I think it's important to emphasize two dimensions of this historic bill. The first is that this was the most expansive measure for the social safety net since the Great Society, in terms of the increase in the earned income tax credit, the child tax credit, aid for those who are struggling with rental or mortgage payments or heating or utilities bills, grants for small businesses, $1,400 survival checks for those earning less than $75,000. This made our social safety net stronger. This put money directly into the pockets of working Americans and middle-class Americans. Number two, this was a jobs and infrastructure program. $350 billion for states and cities, $130 billion for K-12 public education, $30 billion for transit, $8 billion for airports. This is money that is going to lay the foundation for a roaring recovery this summer, fall, and going forward. Milford is going to get more than $2 million directly from the federal government, and it's got an elastic range of uses that it can spend that money on, from water and broadband and sewer upgrades to improving essential services that it's offering its constituents.
Now, walking in, what's your first impression of Congress?
So I've walked into a very kinetic first 100 days. My first Wednesday was an insurrection. My second Wednesday was an impeachment. My third Wednesday was the inauguration of Joe Biden. And my fourth Wednesday, we started work on the biggest piece of legislation arguably in American history, with the American Rescue Plan. So it's been a fast and furious start. I go to bed every night tired, wake up every day energized though. And really, I know that I've got three core missions as a member of Congress. One is to represent the values of this district, to come to the House chamber knowing that my first job is to reflect the values and principles of the 750,000 people of the Massachusetts 4th. Number two is to advance their priorities, whether it is delivering for them through the appropriations and infrastructure bills to get projects back home, or to advance more national priorities like immigration reform or large-scale infrastructure and childcare spending. And then number three is to deliver world-class constituent services. Barney Frank and Joe Kennedy before me were well known for taking care of constituent needs, and the staff that I've hired for the district office are hitting the ground running on that front as well.
So now, you mentioned infrastructure improvements. Where do you see the biggest challenges we have here in the 4th?
So it changes a little bit throughout the district, north and south. So in the northern part of the district, the Alston Interchange project and the Framingham-Worcester line are two pinch points in terms of transportation infrastructure. In the southern part of the district, on the south coast, making sure that we complete the South Coast Rail on time, ensuring that we have a vibrant offshore wind industry and that we're laying the foundation for a really good offshore wind cluster is important. Everywhere in the district, housing is critical. And then I know that in Milford and surrounding towns, water and broadband are going to continue to be important issues. One of the things to point out about the American Rescue Plan, like I said, is that the money can be used expressly on water, broadband, and sewer upgrades. So there's a real opportunity there.
Now, I've seen that you've commented a lot on getting kids back in the classroom. Any thoughts on that?
It was an issue I was working on even before taking office. We worked closely with local officials throughout the district on a pooled coronavirus testing program early this winter to ensure that we were testing kids weekly and that we are creating the confidence and transparency amongst parents and students and administrators to demonstrate that the schools are safe and that we can reopen them fully for full in-person learning without risking new outbreaks. And it's imperative to me that we fully reopen the schools. We can do it safely. We can make sure that teachers are safe, and we can make sure that students are getting the education they deserve.
Do you see any obstacles to opening up the classrooms?
I mean, absolutely. I think every local official throughout the district would tell you that there are a tremendous amount of obstacles. The funding in the ARP will help that. Like I said, we're setting aside $130 billion nationally for K-12 public education. But really, especially as we extend vaccinations throughout the entire adult population, I think some of the concerns will ease, but there's no question. This is a transition. It's a transition for teachers who have understandable concerns after this last year. And it's a transition for students too. I've heard from a number of parents that the socio-emotional impairments from learning remotely for the last year could actually be exacerbated by going back now all of a sudden to full in-person learning. And so we've got to really be mindful, not just that we have interrupted and in some cases gone backwards on learning, but we also have a lot of work to do in students' mental health as well.
But it's got to ease up some of the burden. When I think of working families and what it costs to hire a full-time, I won't say babysitter, but
It's
caretaker.
prohibitive. We have got to open the schools. And we also need to recognize that childcare is infrastructure, as my friend Catherine Clark says. And I certainly hope that in this forthcoming infrastructure bill, we put in universal pre-kindergarten and a much more robust childcare system in this country, because it's really a burden, as you said, on working families, on moms in particular, and it's unfair for kids.
Well, when you start thinking, especially, I think about the single parent families. I don't know how they keep up. I mean, I had 2 kids, but we had my mother living with us. So it was 3 against 2, and we could barely keep up.
Yes.
When I see what they go through.
I've got a 1-year-old myself. We got another on the way. And without the in-laws and my parents and a lot of support, you're right. It's just incredibly challenging. And we need to recognize that it's not just roads and bridges and transit that create the public good for this country, but also providing care for children.
Well, the 1-year-old will keep you busy.
He does. His name is Teddy.
I was going to say, I had 2 girls, and there was never a dull moment.
No.
Now, we're seeing a lot in the news about immigration. First, the policies, and second, the situation down on the border. Any insights on what we should be doing, what we could be doing?
Well, the Biden administration inherited a broken and immoral immigration system from the Trump administration, and they're doing their best to fix it. An important measure they've taken is reopening the application process for asylum within Central American countries so that people can apply without reaching the border. They are investing in improvements to the facilities and the infrastructure at the border to have it be more efficient. And they are signaling very strongly that now is not the time to come. Perhaps most importantly, though, they are treating humanely the children and families that are reaching the border. Yes, we have a problem at the border, and I've got great confidence in the Biden administration's ability to handle it. But we also need to remember that we have people at the border, and we are a nation of immigrants, and we need to embrace and invest in those who would come here to build a better life.
What do you do when you have that many children? I mean, it's easy for me to ask, but when I start hearing about the magnitude of children coming.
Well, we've got to be careful from indexing too heavily on the Fox News versions of what's happening. 80% of the children who are coming here unaccompanied, for example, have a responsible guardian on the United States side waiting for them. So this is not a tsunami all of a sudden of unaccompanied children coming with nobody there to care for them. There are, of course, a number of kids who are unaccompanied and remain unaccompanied. They are being reconnected with their families. They're being treated humanely. They're being tested for COVID. They're being cared for. And in circumstances where there are shortcomings, the president has made it very clear that he is absolutely committed to upgrading those systems and shelters for them.
So 80% of the kids do have a place to go. It's just a matter of time, is what you're saying.
It's a matter of time and of processing, and there are improvements that need to be made on both fronts. Yeah.
Now, how about locally? I mean, when we think of Massachusetts in the fourth, in Milford especially, we have a large influx of immigrants. You know, first it was the Italians, then the Irish, then the Portuguese, then the Brazilians, now the Guatemalans. It's like a constant replenishment of people. What can we do as a local town to make it easier and better for the immigrants?
Well, it's an important question. My great-grandparents were emigres from the Russian pogroms before World War I. They came to Chelsea and built themselves a life and provided opportunities to their son, my grandfather, to go into medicine that have percolated throughout the generations to give me opportunities they would never have dreamed of. So it's an important question to ask as we remind ourselves after these 4 years that that immigration is a blessing and that we truly want to invest and embrace the people who are coming here. One important measure, and there are many, but one important measure is to expand and to fund appropriately English as a learning language programming, ensuring that both adult and children who are here from other countries are given the education they need to speak English fluently is a really important way to help them integrate to the economy and to feel welcome here.
You know, it's amazing because 40 years ago, my darling bride put it in perspective. When she came to my house, looked at me and said, "Don't you ever speak to your parents in English?" And initially I was going to say, "Of course." Then I stopped and said, "No." You know, it's when you think of English as a second language, a lot of us started that way, not knowing what English was, but, you know, being welcomed by Milford and growing up in it. I've also seen you talk about equal pay action.
Yes, well, we recently marked the Equal Pay Day, which a couple days ago, which is the amount of days into this year that women need to work to earn as much in 2020 as men earned. And it's meant to be a demonstration in a visceral sense of the gap that exists. And unfortunately, that date is even further out for women of color, for Latino women. And it reflects the fact that we do not have an economy right now that rewards equal work with equal pay. I've sponsored several initiatives in Congress to redress that, as well as sponsoring the Equal Rights Amendment time extension to ensure that we codify once and for all into the highest law of the land that women have the full equal civil rights and constitutional liberties as men do.
I have to believe it's still a problem because we're still talking about it. I mean, go ahead.
Yeah, no, it absolutely is still a problem. And unfortunately, this pandemic has only crystallized the disparities that exist in the economy and in dependent care between men and women. Women have disproportionately had to drop out of the workforce to care for kids, but the schools closed to care and to plan around the needs of elderly parents who were in lockdown during COVID. And not only have we done, I think, harm to kids who are not in school full-time learning appropriately, but unfortunately, we've impaired many women's career prospects. And we've got to recognize that as a country, and we've got to make it right.
It still amazes me because people have wives, they have daughters, they have to have a mother, how they can not want equal pay for equal work.
Well, here in Massachusetts, we've got a robust commitment to it. We've got to make sure that we bring that commitment to the national level.
Now, on the in the Times and other places, we're hearing a lot of discussion about the filibuster. I don't think most people understand what the filibuster really means. Could you give us some ideas?
Sure. So the simple answer is the filibuster means that the Senate does not function as a majority rules institution. The Senate has 100 senators. And in a majority rules institution, 51 votes would let you pass a law. That's how it works in the House. The House has 435 members, and a majority lets you pass a law. In the Senate, it's not 51, it's 60. And the reason it's 60 is a relatively obscure 19th century rule that allows any individual senator to filibuster legislation, and to end the filibuster, you need to have 60 votes for cloture instead of 51. What this has done is it's allowed senators who represent about 20% of Americans to prevent any legislation from passing. And so we have seen in the beginning of the 117th Congress, for example, that the House has passed legislation to protect voting rights with H.R. 1 and H.R. 4, to pass common sense gun safety legislation, to protect immigrants and holders of temporary protected status, to pass the Violence Against Women Act, to pass the ERA extension. And all of these are going to get bottled up in the Senate because the Republicans are not willing to play ball even remotely on any of these issues. If we want to ensure the franchise in states like Georgia and Arizona and Texas and North Carolina, especially in Georgia, given the law that was just passed yesterday that really is taking away electoral integrity, we need to abolish the filibuster and allow the Senate to function as it was constitutionally meant to function, which is as a majority institution.
But is the 60 vote rule, does it have any benefits, like to make sure that, and today we're at 50-50. You got to reach across the aisle. Is there any benefit to keeping it?
The filibuster has been weaponized. So it was not, when it was first introduced in the 19th century, it really wasn't used all that often at first. But then during Reconstruction, again during the Civil Rights era in the 1960s, and then finally in the Obama era, it was consistently used to obstruct civil rights legislation. Over and over again, when you actually look at the track record of the filibuster, it has been, to put a fine point on it, it's been largely southern states blocking the advancement of civil rights. And at this point, it has gotten to the position where we actually just are having a hard time governing ourselves as a country when the Senate is being bottled up by senators who represent 20%, not a majority, 20% of all Americans. So at this point, it's a vestige that has become actively harmful to our ability to self-govern as a nation. I want to be clear that allowing the Senate to function as a majority-based institution does not in any way undermine this country's robust protection for minority and civil rights. We have very strong codifications in the Bill of Rights, in the federal and state judiciaries, and indeed through parliamentary processes in the House and Senate to ensure that individual rights are not obstructed. This is not about trying to trample on the voice of the minority. This is about trying to govern, period.
But does it worry you that if you do away with it and the midterms come and one seat changes hands?
I view it less as a Republican versus Democrat thing. I view it more as a governing versus not governing thing. Right now, we can't govern. With the filibuster in place, really neither party, whether Republican or Democrat, really could effectively govern if they got all three branches as we did in 2020. Even then, it creates this kind of permanent sclerosis in the government. I want to have a country that can govern. And I'm a Democrat. I think Democrats are going to do a better job of it. I'm willing to go sort of scorecard for scorecard and say, yeah, give Democrats a chance to govern. We'll show the country what we can do. And if we totally, mess it up and Republicans are given both branches of the Congress and the presidency, well, we'll go toe for toe and see how they govern. But that's the way this country is supposed to work, where elections have consequences. And right now we're in a place where government doesn't happen at all.
How is it the feeling leaving Massachusetts, where I always had a hard time telling the difference between a liberal Republican and a conservative Democrat in Massachusetts? That middle ground always seemed to blur. It doesn't seem like there's any gray area down in Washington.
I wouldn't say that. It gets amplified and polarized through the lens of the media, because cable news and social media especially they try to create echo chambers. There's a lot of people in Congress who are there in good faith, representing their districts with priorities that have significant overlap. Are there wings of each party that are far apart? Of course there are. And there are a lot of issues where, frankly, I'm far apart with Republicans on immigration, on gun safety, on reproductive rights. I've got very strongly held progressive principles and not a whole lot of wiggle room in terms of my ability or willingness to compromise on them. But there are a lot of issues: infrastructure, foreign policy, investments in clean water and broadband and transportation that we can absolutely find consensus with, or at least build some type of a center.
Well, that's good to hear, because I find myself leaving my house listening to CNN for the first half of the trip, Fox for the second half of the trip, trying to figure out where in the middle reality is.
Well, I want to make a distinction between bipartisanship and unity. The president in his inauguration called for unity. It was a call that resonated with me, and I'm sure with many of our viewers, after 4 years of just constant divisiveness. I would posit that you can have very unifying legislation without having it be bipartisan, though. The American Rescue Plan is a great example of that. American Rescue Plan has 70% support from the American people. 70%. And yet it passed on a party line vote. I will absolutely go to the constituents in my district who are Republicans or independents and Democrats and talk about why I think the American Rescue Plan is good for the entire body politic, why it's a unifying piece of legislation, even though it passed on partisan votes. I would do the same thing for gun safety legislation. 70, 80, 90% of Americans support universal background checks, safe storage laws, extreme risk protection orders. And yet, if we were able to pass gun safety legislation, which with the filibuster we can't, that would probably pass on basically partisan lines as well. Again, I would go to my constituents of all party identifications, though, and say this was a unifying piece of legislation based on the American electorate itself.
Now, Jake, you mentioned gun safety. And all we hear is, protect the Second Amendment from one group and protect our kids from another. But is it really doing away with guns, or is it making it a little more practical and safe for gun owners?
I use the term common sense quite deliberately. I'm going to put forward a couple of propositions that I think, without having done a huge amount of research, most viewers would say make good sense. And I can tell you, having done the research, that in fact they're empirically supported as well. One, if you want to buy a gun, we should make sure that you haven't committed a violent crime in the past. Two, if you are abusing your domestic partner, or if you show signs of being mentally unstable, the police should be able to take your guns away from you. Three, if you own a gun, you need to store it in a way that kids can't access it. Four, you don't need an automatic weapon with a 30 magazine clip. Those are four things that I would say are pretty, on the face of them, common sense. Democrats have tried to pass all of them, and they've just been bottled up by the filibuster.
Well, I have a hard time understanding that I should support somebody who says, I need to buy a gun right now. I'm not against people owning guns, but if somebody walks in and says, I need to buy one this instant, my antenna go up immediately saying, okay. If I want to buy a gun and I got to wait a week.
The perpetrator of the atrocity in Atlanta purchased his 9mm with a 100-second background check and committed the atrocity the same day that he purchased that gun. Nobody needs expedited ordering of weapons.
Yeah, and that's my point. If I know I want to buy whatever gun, and I don't need to buy a bazooka, if I'm going to go hunting or whatever, a reasonable arm, I can plan a week ahead, do my background check.
Well, no self-respecting hunter that I've met thinks that they need a 30 magazine clip to fell the deer either.
Well, when I was a kid, I used to go and we had 4 rounds, and that was for the weekend. So I don't know what I would do with 30 rounds. Jake, unfortunately, we're coming pretty close to where Matt will cut me off. What do you see your biggest challenges coming up?
My challenge will be, and it's a challenge and also frankly a fun opportunity, is to use the appropriations process, basically the budget for the federal government, as well as this upcoming infrastructure bill that's being negotiated, to try to get as many wins for the district as possible. We are able, as members of the committees and as members of Congress broadly, to put in requests for our districts and say, hey, we want these projects. I'm working with local officials in Milford as well, and with state officials, people like Representative Brian Murray, on what the priorities should be across my district. And we want to prioritize, ensure that there is collective buy-in, and then go to bat for them.
Well, we're absolutely looking forward to seeing you in Milford. Love to introduce you around whenever you're available. Thank you for taking the time to come on the show tonight. And hopefully next time we can get a little more from Matt.
Be well. Thanks for having me on, Al.
Thanks so much. Look forward to our next meeting. And as always, to our 6 loyal viewers, may tomorrow be a better day than today. God bless and good night.
Not too long since I've been home, been running all my life just